Listen closely, for the past has a way of speaking to us, sometimes in the faintest of whispers. The Willow Creek murders were a sensation, a tragedy of wealth and violence that seemed brutally simple on the surface. But 30 years behind bars haven't silenced the questions, the persistent feeling that the full story remains hidden, locked away like the men who committed the crime. Now, a legal twist has reopened the wounds, and as the spotlight returns to that grand, silent house, a forgotten sound, a chilling detail, may finally reveal the true, horrifying melody of the Sterling family's demise. Part 1. The Stain on Willow Creek. Willow Creek Estates prided itself on its quiet exclusivity, its manicured lawns and houses that stood like discreet fortresses of wealth. But for 3 decades, one house, the Sterling Mansion on Blackwood Lane, had been a blight, a source of morbid curiosity and lingering unease. It stood empty, decaying gracefully behind wrought iron gates, a silent monument to the night of August 20th, 1989. That was the night Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, pillars of the community, titans of industry and philanthropy, were executed in their own study, shot multiple times at close range. A crime of shocking brutality that ripped through the veneer of privilege and safety like a chainsaw through silk. And the perpetrators, apprehended swiftly, were their own children. Mark Sterling, barely out of college at 21, and his younger brother, Kevin, just 18. The media descended like vultures. Headlines screamed, "Rich kids kill parents for money," and "privilege ends in patricide." The initial narrative was brutally simple. 2 spoiled, entitled youths impatient to inherit their parents' vast fortune, resorting to cold-blooded murder. Then came the trials, plural. The defense introduced a counter-narrative, a harrowing account of years of alleged physical, emotional, and psychological abuse at the hands of their father, Arthur, with their mother, Eleanor, portrayed as either complicit or too terrified to intervene. They painted a picture not of greed, but of desperation, of young men driven to the brink by a monstrous father, acting in a moment of perceived self-preservation, a preemptive strike against threatened violence. This conflicting testimony captivated and repelled the nation. Juries were hung, unable to reconcile the horrifying crime with the equally horrifying claims of abuse. Finally, after years of legal battles, both brothers were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. When the state closed the books, justice had prevailed. The greedy killers were behind bars. But even then, in the quiet aftermath, a persistent hum of doubt lingered. Had the full truth been told? Or had the sheer horror of the crime, the wealth of the victims, and the media frenzy overshadowed a darker, more complex reality? 30 years blurred. The Sterling brothers became figures of morbid fascination, their story retold in documentaries, books, and cautionary tales. Life without parole felt like an eternal silence. Until now. A new state law, recognizing the different culpability of young adults whose brains were still developing, allowed certain inmates sentenced for crimes committed under the age of 26 to petition the court for resentencing. Mark had been 21, Kevin 18. They qualified. In a recent, highly contested ruling by the Northwood County Superior Court judge had just cleared the way for their resentencing hearing to proceed. The news landed like a bombshell. The current district attorney, Patricia Chun, tough-on-crime veteran, was furious, openly criticizing her predecessor's initial support for the review. She appeared on television, her voice sharp with indignation. These men committed an unspeakable act, she declared, motivated by greed and a stunning lack of humanity. They received a just sentence, and we will fight tooth and nail to ensure they remain exactly where they are. On the other side, Ms. Reyes, the brother's defense attorney, calmly argued the merits of a new law and her client's remarkable record of rehabilitation over 3 decades. Regardless of the past, she stated in a press conference, her gaze steady, the law recognizes that young people are capable of change. Mark and Kevin Sterling have dedicated their lives in prison to personal growth and helping others. They deserve to have their case reviewed through the lens of modern understanding. The public was instantly polarized, dragged back to the gruesome details and the agonizing question of motive. Had they killed for money or out of terror? Could monsters truly be rehabilitated? The debate raged online, on airwaves, in whispered conversations in Willow Creek grocery stores. The Sterling case, a dark stain on the county's history, was bleeding into the present, forcing people to confront not just the crime, but the unsettling possibility that the definitive ending they'd accepted might not be the whole story. The air in Northwood County felt thick with tension, heavy with the ghosts of the past. Part 2. The unquiet past takes a listener. Alara Vance wasn't just interested in the Sterling case because it was local history. She was drawn to its fundamental dissonance. A brutal crime, a seemingly simple motive, countered by claims of horrific abuse. It felt like a knot that hadn't been properly untangled, just cut. As a freelance journalist constantly chasing dwindling opportunities, the resentencing hearing presented a chance for a deeper dive, a story with layers beneath the obvious headlines. She started her research in the hushed, climate-controlled archive room of the Northwood County Gazette. Rows of microfiche cabinets held decades of local history. She found the 1989 and 1990 reels for the Sterling coverage. The early articles were a whirlwind of shock and speculation. Neighbors describing Arthur Sterling as a sharp businessman, maybe a little demanding, but successful. Eleanor as elegant, devoted to her boys, involved in charity work. The boys themselves were often described as quiet, polite, privileged, but seemingly normal teenagers. Then came the arrests, and the narrative began to fracture. "Look at this," Alara muttered to herself, scrolling through the tiny text on the screen. A small article on page B3 from September 1989, buried beneath a large headline about jury selection. Sterling family friend expresses disbelief at abuse claims. It quoted a Mrs. Gable, described as a longtime friend of Eleanor's, saying, "Arthur could be strict, yes, but abusive? Never." And Eleanor adored those boys. This defense is simply outrageous. But then, an article a week later, a short interview with a distant cousin who hadn't been close to the immediate family. Arthur always had a temper. And Eleanor, she always seemed a bit fragile, like she was walking on eggshells sometimes. I didn't see anything, mind you, but the news, it didn't entirely shock me. Alara leaned back, rubbing her temples. These small contradictions, the conflicting public and private faces, were what pulled her in. The prosecution had effectively steamrolled the abuse claims, portraying them as a desperate, fabricated defense. But reading the raw reports from the time, before the state's narrative solidified, she saw glimpses of a less perfect reality. The defense's testimony about specific incidents, while lurid, also contained details that felt strangely specific. Not just generic claims of beatings, but accounts of bizarre punishments, psychological games, and an atmosphere of constant fear and control. She mentioned her research over coffee with a friend, Mark Jenkins, a seasoned investigative journalist for a national paper who had covered the Sterling case peripherally back in the day. The Sterling case? Seriously, Ilera? Mark scoffed, stirring his black coffee. It's done. Closed. Greedy rich kids killed their parents. End of story. But what about the abuse claims? Ilera pressed. They were pretty detailed, and the hung juries show some people believe them. Mark shrugged. Defense strategy. Throw enough mud, maybe something sticks. The crime itself was too brutal, Ilera. Shot them execution style. That's not a kid lashing out in fear. That's cold. Or it's a complete breakdown after years of terror, Ilera countered, perhaps more vehemently than she intended. What if the father was truly a monster? Yeah, and what if I'm secretly a billionaire? Mark said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Look, I get the fascination. It's a hell of a story. But the system decided. They're guilty. They're staying in prison. Don't waste your time chasing ghosts. His cynicism was a cold splash of water, but it didn't extinguish Ilera's interest. It solidified it. Everyone accepted the official narrative. But official narratives, Ilera knew from experience, often had seams, places where the truth was stretched thin to fit a convenient shape. The fact that the abuse claims had been so vigorously attacked, so easily dismissed by many, felt less like proof of their falsehood and more like proof of how effectively Arthur Sterling might have controlled his image and his family. The unquiet past of the Sterling family, silenced for decades, seemed to be whispering to her, urging her to listen closer. Part 3. Navigating the Maze of Silence. Ilera expanded her search, venturing beyond the tidy records of the newspaper archives. She sought out anyone connected, however tangentially, to the Sterling household or Arthur Sterling's world. She found George Wilkins, a retired groundskeeper who'd worked on the Sterling estate for 15 years before the murders. He was hesitant at first, pottering around his small garden, the memory clearly bringing him discomfort. Mr. Wilkins, Ilera began gently, I'm looking into the Sterling case again, because of the resentencing. He stopped digging, leaning on his shovel. Oh, that again. Folks won't let it rest. Will they? Did you ever see or hear anything unusual when you worked there? Arguments, anything that seemed off? He sighed, looking out over his own well-tended lawn. Mr. Sterling, he was a hard man, demanding, yelled a lot. About the hedges, the leaves on the drive, anything that wasn't perfect. He paused. He didn't just yell at me, either. I heard him inside sometimes. Loud, like thunder. At the boys? At Mrs. Sterling? He shifted uncomfortably. Hard to say who specifically. Just yelling. Sounded mean. Mrs. Sterling, she was quiet. Frightened, maybe? Always seemed nervous when he was around. The boys. They kept to themselves. Didn't see much of them. They were gone a lot, school and such. When they were home, they stayed scarce when their father was there. His account was vague, but it echoed the defense's portrayal of a volatile household dominated by Arthur. It wasn't direct evidence of abuse, but painted a picture of a home where yelling and tension were common, a far cry from the public image of domestic bliss. Next, Ilera located Martha Simmons, who had been a junior paralegal at the Northwood County District Attorney's Office during the Sterling trials. She was now elderly, living in a nursing home, her memories sometimes hazy, sometimes startlingly clear. The Sterling case, she mused, her eyes distant. Oh, that was a mess. So much pressure. DA wanted a conviction so badly. Did you ever see the evidence? Alara asked. The physical evidence? The reports? Bits and pieces, Martha recalled. So many boxes. The defense kept trying to bring in all this stuff about the father, old school records, reports from teachers about the boy's behavior changing. The DA fought it tooth and nail, said it was character assassination, irrelevant to the murders themselves. She paused, a frown creasing her brow. I remember one report. Something about the father's study. A hidden camera, I think, or sound recording equipment. It was dismissed as a security measure, standard for wealthy homes, but it struck me as odd. Why record your own family in the study? A hidden camera or recorder. This was new. Alara made a note. It could be innocent, but combined with the claims of psychological control, it felt chilling. She hit walls too. Former neighbors who refused to talk, still uncomfortable revisiting the trauma. Law enforcement personnel who were tight-lipped, citing ongoing legal matters, the resentencing. People who genuinely believed the brothers were pure evil and saw any inquiry into the abuse claims as an insult to the victims. Alara felt increasingly like she was walking through a maze built of silence and denial, trying to find the cracks in a 30-year-old facade. The more she looked, the less solid the original truth felt. The public narrative was a sturdy, simple box: greed killed parents. But Alara was finding evidence that the real story was a tangled, thorny mess, far more complex and terrifying. The psychological pressure mounted as she delved deeper, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurring in the murky history she was unearthing. She started having unsettling dreams, fragments of the gruesome crime scene, reports mingling with the whispers of abuse claims. The case wasn't just a story anymore. It was starting to invade her thoughts, her sleep, her sense of what was real and what was hidden. One evening, she spoke with Ms. Reyes, sharing the difficulty in getting people to talk and the fragmented nature of what she was finding. It's always like this with these kinds of cases, Alara, Reyes said, her voice tired but resolute. People want a simple villain, a simple motive. The idea that a beloved community figure could be a monster at home is too unsettling. They'd rather believe the kids were just evil. It's easier. Was there anything you felt was truly critical that the jury just never got to see or understand properly? Alara asked. Reyes was silent for a long moment. There were many things, she finally said. The cumulative effect of the trauma, not just isolated incidents. The psychological games. Break time equals 0. 3S/Arthur Sterling wasn't just physically intimidating. He was a master manipulator. He controlled every aspect of their lives, their money, their relationships, even their thoughts. He instilled fear so deeply it became part of their DNA. And there was one specific detail, a seemingly small thing Kevin testified about, that the prosecution ridiculed and the judge eventually limited heavily. Something that symbolized his control, his cruelty. What was it? Alara pressed, her heart pounding. A whistle, Reyes said softly. A small, wooden whistle. A whistle. Alara remembered reading about it in the transcripts, a bizarre, almost unbelievable detail that the prosecution had used to paint Kevin as unstable or fabricating. Now, hearing Reyes speak of it, it felt less like a strange anecdote and more like a key. a key to understanding the specific nature of the terror the Sterling brothers claimed to have lived under. A chilling sound that might have dictated their moments of fear. Part 4. The breath of the whistle. The morning of the resentencing hearing, Alara felt a nervous energy buzzing in the air. She was there primarily as a journalist, observing the proceedings, but her parallel investigation had given her a unique perspective, a sense of the unseen history pressing down on the courtroom. D.A. Chun was sharp, relentless, portraying Mark and Kevin Sterling as threats who hadn't genuinely reformed. Ms. Reyes presented evidence of their decades of good behavior, their work in prison programs, their expressions of remorse, filtered, Alara noted, through the lens of their original defense. The brothers, projected onto a large screen, looked like shadows of the young men in the old trial photos, their faces etched with the passage of time and the weight of their confinement. While the legal arguments droned on, Alara spent her lunch break at the court clerk's office. Ms. Reyes had arranged for her to access a final set of evidence boxes, materials that were collected from the Sterling home but deemed tangential and never fully processed or admitted into the original trials. It was a long shot, mostly personal effects that the prosecution likely saw as irrelevant to their greed motive. The room was small, climate-controlled, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Boxes were stacked neatly, labeled with case numbers and contents lists that were often frustratingly vague. Sterling, Arthur and Eleanor, miscellaneous personal effects. Alara donned latex gloves and began. It was tedious work. Old tax documents, photo albums filled with generic vacation pictures, Eleanor Sterling's address books, Arthur Sterling's business card collection. Mundane remnants of lives that had ended violently. She felt like an archaeologist sifting through the dust of a collapsed civilization. She opened a small wooden box about the size of a shoebox, labeled Simply Study, Shelf 3. Inside were more photographs, loose and unsorted. Pictures of family gatherings, holiday photos, casual snapshots. She flipped through them, seeing the familiar faces of Arthur and Eleanor Sterling smiling, posing with their sons. The perfect family tableau. It felt almost macabre given what she knew or suspected about their private lives. Then she saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of vacation photos, face down, was a single, smaller print. It looked different, grainier, poorly lit, not posed. She picked it up carefully. It was a candid shot, taken from a slightly elevated angle, perhaps through a doorway or from a hidden spot. The scene was the Sterling study, recognizable from trial photos. Arthur Sterling was in the foreground, his back mostly to the camera. He was standing tense, rigid, and in his hand, held loosely at his side, was a small, dark object. Her breath caught in her throat. In the background, partially obscured by Arthur's body and the poor lighting, stood a younger figure. It took her a second, her mind racing, to recognize him. Kevin. He looked terrified. His shoulders were hunched, his hands slightly raised as if warding something off, and he was looking directly at the object in his father's hand. Alara's eyes darted back to the object. It was small, dark wood with some sort of intricate carving. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. Recognition dawned, a chilling wave washing over her. It was the whistle. The small, wooden whistle Kevin had testified about, the one his father used as a signal for humiliating punishments, a symbol of his absolute psychological control. The detail the prosecution had mocked, the judge had deemed inadmissible as direct evidence of the crime. But here it was, Not just a claim in a transcript, but a tangible, if blurry, image. The whistle in Arthur Sterling's hand, the look of pure terror on his teenage son's face. It didn't show the physical abuse, the beatings the defense also claimed. But it showed the psychological terror, the specific, twisted dynamic that Kevin had described. It validated a key part of the defense's narrative that had been largely dismissed. It transformed the whistle from a bizarre, potentially fabricated detail into a potent symbol of the abusive environment the brothers claimed drove them to their breaking point. This photograph wasn't a smoking gun for acquittal, not in the eyes of the law or public opinion fixed on the murders themselves. But for Alera, it was a thunderclap of truth in the long silence. It fundamentally changed the context of the crime. It wasn't just about money anymore, or even just physical violence. It was about a deep, pervasive psychological terror, triggered perhaps by the sound of a simple wooden whistle that had festered and ultimately exploded with unimaginable force. The photograph was proof that the monster wasn't just the outcome of the crime. He was the man who held the whistle. She immediately called Ms. Reyes, her voice trembling slightly as she described her discovery. Reyes's reaction was a mix of shock and urgent determination. This was it, the missing piece. They worked quickly, preparing a motion to introduce the photograph and its context to the judge in the resentencing hearing. It was a long shot. The hearing was focused on the brothers' rehabilitation and the original sentencing parameters, not a relitigation of the crime itself. In court, Ms. Reyes presented the photograph, explaining its significance in corroborating the long-dismissed claims of psychological abuse centered around the whistle. District Attorney Chun was on her feet instantly, objecting vehemently. "This is irrelevant, Your Honor." A blatant attempt to retry the original case, to garner sympathy for convicted murderers using an undated, blurry photograph and discredited testimony. The judge listened patiently, examining the photo. He acknowledged its potential relevance to the context of the crime, but ultimately sustained the objection. This hearing is for resentencing based on the defendant's age at the time of the crime and their conduct since, he stated, his voice firm. While this photograph and the associated claims may be material to a motion for a new trial, they are not admissible in these proceedings. The original convictions stand. The door Alera had momentarily opened slammed shut. The truth contained within the photograph, the chilling validation of the whistle's significance, would not be part of the official record of the resentencing hearing. Part 5. The lingering hum of the whistle. The judge's ruling was decisive. The resentencing hearing concluded with Mark and Kevin Sterling's request denied. Their life sentences without parole were upheld. The court, bound by the narrow scope of the hearing and unwilling to revisit the deep complexities of the original case, had affirmed the decades-old outcome. For the state, for the current district attorney, justice had been served again. The media reported the outcome as expected, another chapter closed on a notorious crime. For Alera, the sense of closure was anything but complete. The photograph of the whistle remained seared into her mind, a potent symbol of a hidden reality. The legal system had looked at it and deemed it outside the scope of the current proceedings, but for her, it illuminated the Sterling case in a terrifying new light. It confirmed that the defense's narrative of a deeply abusive home, while perhaps not a legal justification for murder, was likely far more truthful than the prosecution's simplistic greed motive. The monster wasn't just the brothers. The monster had been their father, and his cruelty symbolized by that small wooden whistle, had created the conditions for the eventual explosion of violence. Alara wrote her article. She detailed her investigation, the interviews, the conflicting accounts, the frustrating obstacles. She focused heavily on the discovery of the photograph and the whistle, presenting it not as proof of innocence, but as crucial context that had been missed or deliberately excluded. She argued that the legal system, in its pursuit of a clear-cut narrative, had failed to fully grapple with the complex, disturbing reality of the Sterling family dynamics, leaving fundamental questions unanswered. The article garnered attention, sparking debate online and in niche publications. Some praised her for uncovering new information and challenging the established narrative. Others, particularly those still firmly convinced of the brothers' unadulterated evil, criticized her for attempting to humanize murderers and dredge up irrelevant history. District Attorney Chun publicly dismissed the article as sensationalism and revisionist history. Break time equals 0. 7S/Ms. Reyes continued to pursue legal avenues, attempting to use the photograph and other information Alara uncovered as grounds for a motion for a new trial. But the bar for a new trial decades after conviction is incredibly high, and with the district attorney's office staunchly opposed, the path was steep and uncertain. Mark Sterling, quiet and gaunt, died in prison a few years later, never having seen freedom outside the prison walls as an adult. Kevin remained incarcerated, his appeals exhausted, his face visible only in faded photographs and on the occasional news special rehashing the case. His hope for resentencing extinguished, his life settled back into the gray monotony of prison routine. The mansion on Blackwood Lane eventually sold, torn down to make way for a new, modern structure. Willow Creek Estates moved on, burying its dark history under new construction and manicured lawns. But for Alara, the case never truly ended. The hum of the unquiet past, the chilling symbol of the whistle, the terrified look on Kevin's teenage face, these things stayed with her. They were a constant reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about good and evil, about justice and crime, are often too simple, too clean. That true horror can reside behind the most perfect facades, that the wounds inflicted in private spaces can fester for decades, their echoes reaching across time. The silence of the Sterling mansion was gone, but the psychological sound of a small wooden whistle continued to echo in the quiet corners of Alara's mind, a chilling testament to the enduring power of hidden trauma and the unsettling truth that some monsters are made, not born, in the darkest corners of family secrets.